All right. So, welcome back to Lecture 1, Part 2 of Truth, the Search for Meaning. Here we have methods of truth seeking. So, let me just read this to start it off. How we search for truth already determines a lot about what we will find uh, due to the integral nature of the methods we use to arrive at truth. This is like a group of people, each restricted to their own senses to describe what an elephant is, right? So, one will say that it's a smell, the other will say it's a texture, and yet another will say it's a sound, and so on. So, that's really just a very simple example to try to um, intuitively help someone grasp onto the idea that the methods that we use will ultimately determine the result that we're going to get. And if you use one method and that determines a certain result, but you also have the awareness that there are multiple methods that each lead to their own results, then it also tells you, logically speaking, that you're not actually arriving at the unitary truth that we're looking for, which would be the combination of all those, or at least their integration somehow. So that's something that is very important to realize when we are choosing a method or trying to look for a method for arriving at an absolute unitary truth. That being said, the other thing that I like to mention is that an absolute truth would necessarily answer all of the main questions that we have about the nature of reality. So what is it? Where and when is it happening? How is it happening? Who, which is what is its identity, and why? Like, why is it occurring? Existence and everything. Ultimately, I'm already starting to reveal that the search for truth is tied to understanding existence. I mean, everything kind of derives off of that. So, what, where, when, how, who, and why are questions whose answer should fit in like a key into all of these locks. All of them should be answered. If truth is unitary, then by necessity, all of the answers would be integral. And so, I've listed off a couple of different things here. We have logic, philosophy, science, and spirituality. These are, let's call them the main branches or the methods that we actually use to seek out truth. And of course, they all have their own utilities. So logic helps us do a lot of different things. Obviously, we use it in the most basic of ways to make sense of the world, but it is also used for computation, it's used for science. And then, of course, science itself is a method that we use to arrive at patterns that we observe in the universe that we can reproduce so that we can harness a certain level of utility to arrive at technology. Jesus, I'm getting a lot of messages tonight. And so, material truth is what we arrive at through science. Logic is how we arrive at a lot of different kinds of truths. Philosophy, very closely linked to logic, obviously, but this is where we're going to discuss a little bit later on my own philosophy, which is a lot of it revolves around paradoxes. Now, is there a logical way to integrate a paradoxical framework into the search for truth? If so, then is it logical? Well, yes, but it's also paradoxical at the same time. This is, again, abstract and something that we'll dive into a little bit later on. But I do think that just the simple act of reflection, philosophizing, is a method that we use to arrive at truth, obviously, and that it's not necessarily always tied to logic. That's why I've, made the two separate insofar as the methods that I'm enumerating here. And then spirituality. So spirituality is, I would define it to be a direct experience of truth. It's when you connect with truth on a level that goes beyond rationality. So in a way, it's kind of like a science, right? The science of spirituality is that you're empirically arriving at truth by, I would say, in some fashion, being it, becoming the truth. When you feel existential, that you are touching truth on some level. So spirituality is a practice that we use to arrive at that, alluding to what I had said earlier in part one, that truth does fall into a binary, an experience and then a concept. But what we're going to attempt to do or actually do is to give a concept to that experience. And if we could do that in such a manner that there's a perfect one-to-one ratio or like a reflection that is very clear and simple, then perhaps we have found, at the very least, the concept that is possible to describe the experience of absolute truth. because the experience itself is always greater than the definition, which is an argument that I think we can understand as we go through this. Before moving on to part three, let's see what I wrote here. What is your method? Yeah. So, I think it's important to be aware of the method that you're using. Some people are just using their own logic, or they philosophizing, they're, subscribing to science and just defaulting to whatever science says about the nature of reality. And then, others are practicing spirituality in various forms. What is yours? I would invite you to think about what method of truth seeking that you subscribe to, and perhaps start to give credence to the idea that you should be open-minded in insofar as using every method together, that they all have a certain level of value, because this is what we're trying to do here in this lecture, is to integrate the different methods of truth seeking. So here we have a recap: from the baked-in programming faculties to the intentional rationalizing and empirical means of obtaining truth. We have a certain amount of integrated truth-seeking method. We're programmed to seek out truth, or to take things as true at a certain face value, just because that's the way we are built and we have that necessity. So, logic is a priori. The way things work, there's no need for any kind of rationalization or empirical proof. It's just more fundamental than that. That would be something like logic. How we perceive the world is highly programmed by our evolutionary, or I should say our biological evolution, so that, we can survive. So the way that we see things isn't actually how they are, but seeing them in that way is what is helping us survive. So this is very integral. And then the counterpart to that is to use our rationality to go beyond that, to dig deeper and say, hey, what is truth like if we remove those boundaries or those constraints of these integral methods that we have from the get-go? So this is starting to massage the endeavor a little bit more, of giving us an intention, a goal, a purpose, a direction, insofar as this is what we're going to be doing here, is integrating the different methods of truth seeking, being aware of what it is that we have like bias, and to see how much we can sort of start to focus in on the clarity of truth here. So this is a part two. It's not too complicated. I think we don't have to overcomplicate it more than that. I think it's clear enough to move on to part three. And here we are.